It's the late 6th century along the northeast coast of Kent, in a land long before the term England was relevant. Almost 200 years ago, the Romans withdrew, and, in their place, new people from Germany and Denmark settled. These new settlers were pagans, and with the slow reduction of Roman Christianity across the British Isles, it seems that the last bit of Roman influence in England had died. In 597, this was all about to change. Somewhere along the coast in Kent, a ship landed, and on board, amongst the crew, a collection of monks anxiously dwelled. The leader of this party was a newly promoted Augustine. He and his party had travelled all the way from Rome, and the task they were set was monumental. Their challenge was to do what had been, for several lifetimes, the unachievable, and something that, if successful, would change the landscape of Europe indefinitely. This is a story of how a monk would go on to convert a pagan king. This is the story of St. Augustine of Canterbury. Join me, a volunteer for English Heritage at St. Augustine's Abbey and a student at the University of Kent, as I take you around a short journey and teach you about the fascinating life of this amazing man. To begin our journey, we're going to St. Augustine's Abbey on the outskirts of Canterbury, the place where he was laid to rest. Now, this site that we're currently in has a really long and interesting history. Usually, as I take people around and I tour them across this site, I've come to realise over time that there are some issues with St. Augustine's legacy. You see, we don't really know that much about him factually. We can make assumptions based on legends and what little we do have on him, but there isn't much documented on him since this almost happened 1500 years ago. The reason why we don't hear much about St. Augustine anymore is because during the 1500 years since he's been dead, several other people from Canterbury have become more famous than him. We have St. Thomas Becket, and we also have the Canterbury Tales. So when people come to Canterbury, that's usually the culture that they want to go and be absorbed in, and that's absolutely fine because it's amazing, but it also means that St. Augustine gets the short straw and nobody leaves Canterbury knowing much about him. There are several issues with St. Augustine's legacy. Firstly, a lot of what we know about him is based on legends. You see, a lot of the readings that we do have on him as a character and as an actual real person, we don't have much information on him. This leaves me with the dilemma of, do I make this documentary, on one hand, just the facts, which means it's going to be incredibly bland and boring, or do I focus it all on legends, which means that you, as a viewer, don't actually learn much about St. Augustine, just the fairy tale surrounding him? The option that I've chosen is to do something in the middle. I've chose to combine what little we do actually know about him with some of the legends that we have surrounding him, and ones that are actually quite feasible. So we can maybe get an idea of the character that St. Augustine could have had, but not get focused on his legends as being real. So to begin with, I wanted to start off with something concrete, something we can actually rely on for the history surrounding St. Augustine. To begin understanding his story, we're going to have to imagine Britain in the time before the Romans had left. We don't know how much of the population actually worshipped Christianity, but we do know that it was strongly present in Britain. After the Romans left, the pocket of power was filled up by Germanic tribes who settled across the southeast of England and spread through the Isles. Unfortunately for the Roman Church, these Germanic people were not Christians, they were pagans. We don't know how much this paganism overtook, but we know that there were still pockets of Christianity come the time of Augustine's arrival here. So, for several centuries, all the Roman Church could do was watch as the Germanic peoples transformed England from being a place where Christianity was very prevalent to a scenario where that was not the case at all. In the 590s, an opportunity came, and Pope Gregory was not keen to miss it. A warlord and king by the name of Ethelbert had managed to subjugate the small Saxon kingdoms up to the River Humber, making them subservient to Kent. Like his ancestors, Ethelbert too was a pagan. With control over the other Germanic kingdoms, his reputation grew enough to where he looked to the continent in order to strengthen his influence. He turns to the kingdom of the Strusia, a Frankish kingdom which today makes up the northern part of France, including Normandy and Paris. The woman he found himself betrothed to was to be a Parisian princess by the name of Bertha. This was unusual, as unlike any other ruler of Kent, the queen of the kingdom was in fact a Christian. Unlike the Saxons, the Franks had been Christian for 3 generations prior to Bertha, and today her character is portrayed as wholly devout. With her betrothal and eventual marriage, Bertha brought across from the land of the Franks a Christian bishop by the name of Ludhard. She was allowed to practice in an old Roman structure outside of Canterbury, which had impressively survived for 2 centuries without any maintenance. This to Pope Gregory was a sign of tolerance, and with it came a window to finally pull the Anglo-Saxons back into the fold. The Pope was particularly keen to see England converted. Several years before, it's recorded he came across some Anglo-Saxons in a slave market in Rome. Asking the slaver who these people were, he responded they were Angles. To this, Pope Gregory declared that they were not Angles, they were angels. With the legend, it is seen that Pope Gregory sent Augustine over from his prior in Rome to Christianise the Kingdom of Kent. However, it is also likely that Ethelbert requested somebody to be sent from Rome. Today, historians will tell you that Kent's power was down to the fact that it was subservient to the Franks, and the marriage to Bertha was a signal that Kent owed its power to the continent. To discuss this more, I'm going to talk to one of my friends and colleagues from St. Augustine's Abbey. Hi, nice for you to be here and to talk with us today. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a volunteer here, been a volunteer here for about 5 years.
Yeah.
And we do tours for English heritage and combined tours with St. Martin's Church and the cathedral, looking specifically at that early period of Augustine's mission.
There are some debates whether or not Bede is correct in his assumption that Augustine arrives in Thanet on his mission sent by Gregory. Ethelbert doesn't have any idea and is surprised by Augustine's arrival here. There are lots of politics that are going on in Kent in that period. Can you tell us your thoughts on essentially Augustine arriving here, and was Ethelbert actually surprised to see Augustine arrive here?
Well, the short answer is we don't know. Bede is writing 125 years after the events. What he is writing, he's been told by Albinus, the 9th abbot of the monastery. The story that he knows is one that's been handed down from generation of abbots at the monastery, none of which had been written down at the time. And it's obviously all written to probably show Gregory in his strongest light and showing Augustine in his strongest light.
Of course.
And we can't take what Bede has written it literally. It gives us a broad brush of what was going on, but without being very strong on the detail. If he was surprised, then it's because the mission had been initiated by Pope Gregory.
Yes.
They knew all about Britannia from its time as part of the Roman Empire. He wasn't entirely sure what had gone on since the Roman army pulled out.
Yeah.
He would have known from activity in the slave markets in Rome that some of the slaves were being brought from, who had been captured in the eastern part of England, which was now occupied by Germanic peoples who had migrated across the North Sea and were practicing Germanic pagan religious practices. Now, if that's the case, then Gregory would have sent that mission on his own volition, and yes, it may well have been a total shock to Ethelbert when they pitched up on Thanet. Now, the alternative scenario is that the mission had been requested by Ethelbert. Ethelbert was married to a Frankish princess, been married for probably 16, 17 years before Augustine's mission arrived. She was a Christian. Franks had been converted to Christianity in the early 5th century, the early 6th century rather. And part of the marriage contract had been that she would be able to practice her Christian faith once she came to Kent. Now, 15, 16, 17 years, it's a long time. It may well have been that Ethelbert was keen to convert to Christianity. The Bishop Luthard, Bertha's chaplain, may have also been trying to persuade Ethelbert on the benefits of converting to Christianity.
Yes.
And the problem for Ethelbert is that he was subject to some degree of Frankish overlordship. Of course, Ethelbert is married to a Frankish princess. The fact that he was married to a Frankish princess probably suggests that he was subject to overlordship. This was if a king sent one of his daughters to marry a king from another kingdom, generally reflected the fact that he was the overlord of that kingdom.
Sure.
The degree to which that Frankish influence was exerted we don't know. There was obviously an awful lot of trade between the two areas. Lots of Frankish grave goods, particularly in the coastal areas. The Franks would have been trying to draw Ethelbert closer into their sphere of influence.
Yes.
While Ethelbert was probably trying to sort of push them away, so to gain some degree of independence for himself. If he had allowed himself to be publicly baptized by Bishop Luthard, who was an agent of the Frankish Church, then that would have symbolized his subservience to the Franks and drawn him closer into their sphere of influence.
So, if we are to believe this theory that Ethelbert is a Frankish, maybe tributary state, he's got some kind of subservience to the Frankish kingdoms, the act of having Augustine over here is a form of him declaring himself as still quite a strong person. We're now going to leave Steve at St. Augustine's Abbey and travel to some of the space that Augustine and his men would have lived and worked in.
This is St. Martin's Church, and this is one of the sites gifted to Augustine by King Ethelbert upon his arrival in Thanet. This site actually has quite the interesting history behind it. Bede tells us in his writings in the 700s that this site was once a great Roman church, but of course Bede wants it to be a church. The honest answer is the original purpose of this site is lost to time. These bricks behind me are all Roman, and they were probably built 300 AD, maybe even later than that. It's debated. This is a very hot point of contention in the historical community, so I need to be careful what I say. When Augustine arrived, he wasn't the first Christian to reuse this site, if it indeed was a church. Bertha, King Ethelbert's wife, had been using this site along with Bertha's chaplain and bishop, Luthard, who was a Frank just like Bertha herself.
What's interesting about all of the bricks that are used in this wall is that it ended up characterizing Augustine's legacy here. The church had normalized the usage of Roman bricks during the construction of churches, and this meant that when Augustine arrived here, naturally churches needed to be built out of this material. The issue was that the Kentish people weren't accustomed to building out of bricks and didn't know how to make them. Fortunately for Augustine and his team, there was an abandoned Roman city just down the road from here. And a lot of the materials that went on to construct the early churches, the ones that we will see on the likes of St. Augustine's and the first cathedral that was built here were all built using stolen bricks from old Roman buildings. In the end, Augustine lived for about 7 to 8 years in England before he passed away. And during his lifetime, he saw Christianity expand outside of Canterbury. Justus, one of the followers of Augustine who accompanied him from Rome, saw the Bishop of Rochester formed under his name. Rochester became one of the most important sites in England and even filled in for Canterbury in the absence of an archbishop in England. It is thought that Augustine was originally meant to become the Archbishop of London. However, the lack of London within Ethelbert's kingdom, London belonged to the East Saxons at the time, prevented him from doing so, and his subservience to Ethelbert ultimately led him to becoming Archbishop of Canterbury.
We're about to take one final detour to St. Augustine's Abbey and speak with an Anglican priest and discuss the legacy that St. Augustine left behind and the Church's view on his footprint.
What we've been looking at across this documentary is the life of St. Augustine, from when he got here, corner of Thanet, to passing. Obviously thinking about the wider aspect of what this man achieved is his church, what he left behind, and successively what happens. And the first thing I think about when I think about Augustine's legacy today is the cathedral behind us, as is the English church, which is a direct successor of what he set up. So
I'm Brian McHenry. I'm a priest in the Church of England. I no longer have responsibility for a church as a vicar, but priests of the Church of England are not allowed to retire. And I continue to take services, pay pastoral visits to people, take part in other activities in the life of the Church of England. But I'm also, as you know, Jamie, a guide here at St. Augustine's Abbey, which I regard as complementary to my role as a priest in the Church of England. Because this is one of the great churches, was one of the great churches, not only in England, but in Western Europe. So you wanted to know about the attitude of the current Church of England to St. Augustine.
Yes.
In general, I think he's held in high veneration. And the story is well known. The bravery of these men who came here, their courage, their determination, the fact that they won over not only the King of Kent, but they also won over many people here. And then the church spread throughout southern England and eastern England. So people do have a very high regard for him. I sometimes think that the story is not sufficiently well known and that there are lessons to be learnt for all of us. I mean, Augustine does seem to be a very human person. His anxiety about whether the mission that he was being sent on by Pope Gregory was really a sensible thing. And being sent back by his brothers. He was sent back by his brothers to Rome to say to the Pope, do you really mean that I've got to go ahead with this? I mean, there is one clue, which is that to do with his encounter with the bishops, the British bishops who were here. There were British bishops. Christianity had not gone altogether from the British Isles after the Roman Empire. It has survived, for example, in Wales, the West Country. And Augustine went for effectively a summit meeting with these British bishops. Well, I don't think it was well handled.
No.
Augustine thought, well, I've come here from Rome, and who are these people? And the British bishops thought, well, who does this man think he is? I mean, all I'm saying is that there's an instance of Augustine, if you like, learning on the job.
Of course.
But he wasn't Archbishop for very long. You know, it's believed he died around about 605, possibly about 8 years after his arrival here. So the work had really only begun. I mean, the church here wasn't finished. And so Augustine had to be buried in that part of the site over there, had been a Roman cemetery, and then later reinterred in the new church in a place of honour towards the East End. So he'd only started a work which, as you say, Jamie, others had to carry forward. And it wasn't easy for his successors, because after all, these ancient religions, which have been brought by the Germanic peoples into Britain, still had their adherents. And there were times when the early archbishops had a really rough time, and they must have thought, goodness, can we get back home? Because the early archbishops were Augustine's brothers, I assume his friends, who followed him on as archbishop. The extraordinary thing is that within about 150 years, you've got Bede, the Venerable Bede, writing about the history of the early church, and it had been really well established throughout a large part of the country.
Of course.
And these ancient gods had largely disappeared. And that is a mark of his triumph. Now, some people would say, wasn't it sad losing those ancient gods? Well, yes. I mean, we live in a pluralist society now, and no doubt people now would say, well, you should have let them get on with it. Live and let live. That wasn't the world in which Augustine was living. He was absolutely convinced that Christianity was the way, and that these other religions were benighted, possibly even works of the devil. I think when we look at history, we have to look at it as far as we can through the eyes of the people who lived at that time.
Thank you so much for our conversation, and
thank you very much for asking me. And we're sitting here in the ruins of St. Augustine's Abbey, which I would encourage everybody, wherever you are, come and visit here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for watching this documentary. And if you want to see any more, please be sure to like and subscribe to On Saxon Shores for more content about the Dark Ages and early medieval period in South England.